Satanic verses is a highly contentious term, and it is in fact so because it was the same title attributed to the novel published by Salman Rushdie in the late 20th century, which sparked much controversy on a global scale to the extent that his life was actually in danger. Now, it's not rather just the actual title of the book itself, but rather the contents of the book, the blasphemous nature of the contents that sparked such huge controversy. But the name itself gives an insight into what exactly is so provocative. So in this video, we'll be talking about the actual original incident, which inspired the name of Salman Rushdie's book, which was published, like I said, in the late 20th century. The incident itself took place in the early Islamic period, rather during the life of the Prophet Muhammad, during his 10-year span in Mecca. So this video will be about the actual original event itself. And of course, this event is actually contestable. Rather, people contest the historicity of the event itself, though it has been narrated by a number of narrators in the biographical traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. So in this video, we'll be covering the early Islamic community's response and distribution of the narration, the biographical narration of the incident. It will also be covering how Orthodoxy developed through the centuries and how that has changed in the modern period to the Orthodoxy that we have in the current day. It'll also be covering the narrators themselves, the gradation, the way that narration is actually investigated in the Islamic tradition, the Hadith tradition. So it'll be covering a number of different topics in this video. So if you're interested in those type of topics, do consider sticking around for the video. This video will be inspired mostly by Shahab Ahmed's academic publication entitled Before Orthodoxy, the Satanic Verses in Early Islam, which is said to be an indisputably prodigious academic work of scholarship by Sean Anthony, another academic. So stick around for the video, and I'll see you in it. Thank you. So orthodoxy is described by Cambridge Dictionary as the traditional beliefs of a religious group or a political party, and is often seen by adherents as the correct and predominant beliefs of a religious group. Think of the development of orthodoxy, namely a time before its inception and widespread acceptance, is to consider a time swarmed with competing ideas, all vying for legitimacy and validation. In the couple of hundred years after the introduction of a faith tradition, this can almost be expected and easily accepted. But to propose the development of orthodoxy developed over centuries and in response to historical events or tides of opposition may pose a threat to the confidence in which defends the strength and validity of religious orthodoxy, and may lend to the opening of one's mind beyond the stronghold of community pressure and dominance. At least this is how I felt after reading Shahab Ahmed's publication entitled Before Orthodoxy, Satanic Verses in Early Islam. The book highlights the changes in attitude and acceptance of the Satanic Verses incident in the life of Prophet Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, believed to be the final messenger sent by God to mankind. Ahmed describes the fundamental finding of the book to be that in the first 2 centuries of Islam, Muslim attitudes to the Satanic Verses incident were effectively the direct opposite of what they are today. Ahmed argues that orthodoxy is not merely an intellectual phenomenon, but is subject to social influence, which Talal Asad describes as not a mere body of opinion, but a distinct relationship, a relationship of power. To get an idea of what they mean by such a description of orthodoxy, one can simply search YouTube for Islamic proselytization on the topic of this contentious issue to see a widespread denial of the incident's occurrence in the life of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, it must be said that this denial is not entirely unfounded, but it is not the full truth, and in fact, the investigation is more complex than some make it appear.
A lot of people are really confused. They go online and they're reading about the fact that there's something called the Satanic Verses, that the shaitan, the devil, Satan, can actually interfere with revelation and kind of put words into the mouth of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And apparently, during the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that actually happened in Mecca. That the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was reciting the Quran and shaitan went there and kind of mixed up his own words into the words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Meccans all heard it and they all got excited and happy and complied. But then the Prophet ﷺ had to come back later and kind of backtrack his statements. If you read that story, if you've ever heard that story, and it really messed with your head and messed with your heart and confused you, guess what? It's what we call, from a technical perspective, mawdu'. It's a fabrication. It's an absolute blatant lie.
Just watched was a clip of a scholar based in the United States going as far as to sum up his seemingly confident conclusions in a short, minutes-long video, simply and plainly dismissing the incident altogether as a fabrication. As I said, this is a complex issue, far from the contents of a couple minutes-long video with definitive speech, as we just saw. But when it comes to such a simple dismissal, this too is not hard to understand. Given that in modern times, religious orthodoxy has claimed that anyone who argues for the historicity of the Satanic Verses Incident is heterodox, and in some cases, a straight-up grade A disbeliever. And of course, for any devout, though layman follower of the tradition, such a stance would be enough to close the book on any further thoughts on the issue, causing relief by means of such a strong, confident dismissal. But is this really the full story? Quite bluntly, no, it is not. And anyone who is aware of the 50 narrations of differing historiographical grading describing the incident, as well as the erudite, well-respected scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah who endorsed the validity of the historical descriptions of the incident, will be sure of this. So this begs the question, what exactly is the incident that provoked and developed such a harsh stance against those who proclaim and argue for its validity? Well, the Satanic Verses Incident is known in Islamic literature as the Qisat and Quranic story of the cranes. It is the name attributed to the incident in which the Prophet is said to have mistaken words of satanic suggestion for divine revelation. The reports state that under the pressure of persecution by the Quraysh during his time in Mecca, Muhammad was eager to be reconciled with his fellow townmates turned foes, and hoped in his heart that a divine revelation would be revealed to this effect. It is in this time that Surah An-Najm was revealed, the very surah to which the Satanic Verses are attributed or contained. He recited this surah or chapter in front of the Quraysh. It is in this recitation that the Prophet had falsely inserted a couplet brought about by the casting of Satan, venerating the pagan goddesses. So you can see how this can be very highly controversial. This couplet came after the recitation of the verses, bringing them to attention, which read, "And have you considered what it is you are worshipping in Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, the third, the other?" It was after this verse that the allegedly mistaken verse was inserted. Indeed, they are high-flying cranes, and indeed their intercession with God is hoped for. At the end of the surah, there was a command for prostration, which all, including both the Quraysh and the Muslims, unsurprisingly submitted to. At a later time, the angel Gabriel visited the Prophet, who informed him that the verses he recited about the goddesses were from Satan, and revealed to him the verses from Surah Al-Hajj, which explained the divine rationale and exterminated satanic interpolation. The verse reads, "We have not sent you before you a messenger or prophet, but that when he recited or desired, Satan casts something into his recitation, but God annuls that which Satan casts and then establishes his signs clearly. And God is all-knowing, all-wise, to make what Satan casts a trial for those whose hearts is a sickness, and those whose hearts are hardened. For indeed the wrongdoers are in far dissension, and to teach those who have been endowed with knowledge that this is the truth from your Lord, that they believe in it and humble their hearts to him. For God guides those who believe to a straight path." To understand why this veneration is significant and highly controversial is to understand the status of the idols in question. The goddesses described in the couplet are Allat, Al-Uzza, and Al-Manat. Allat is grammatically the feminine form of the term Allah and was personified in the form of a statue worshipped in At-Taif, the location of its major shrine. It took the form of a carved white rock shaped like a woman, which was later destroyed when At-Taif entered into Islam a year before the Prophet's death. And there is said to be the remains in At-Taif, which were among those veneration sites subjected to Saudi Wahhabi vandalism. Al-Uzza is the feminine form of Al-Aziz, another name of Allah. It is said to be the leading female deity of the Quraysh, which would explain why the Quraysh would often be known to carry the statues of Al-Uzza and Al-Lat into battle, though the statue no longer exists. Al-Manat is the goddess of fate, and arguably the oldest of these Arab female deities, worshipped among those residing in Western Arabia. She was known to be the deity of the Khazraj and Aus tribes of Yathrib, pre-Islamic Medina, and is depicted as a female figure carrying a measuring rod and flanked by a crescent moon. All three goddesses were viewed as being the daughters of Allah, an inscription blasphemous within the Islamic tradition, but favorable in the eyes of the polytheistic Qurayshi people. Knowing the background information of the goddesses and their high status within the Qurayshi people can give us an understanding of why exactly it narrates that everyone prostrated. I remember I was listening to the Sirah, which is the biography of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is something that we say at times as Muslims after the name of the Prophet. I was listening to the Sirah, and so, by the way, in this video, I'm not using that term because it's supposed to be kind of a more just academic video. It's not meant to be religious in nature. So I just said that naturally, so that's why I just came out. But if you're wondering why I'm not using that term and you yourself are a Muslim, that is why. So basically, I remember listening a couple of years ago to actually the scholar that I had shown a clip of at the beginning of this video, which was Abdul Nasser Jangda, based in the US, specifically in Texas. And they still mention the aspect of the prostration of the Qurayshi people, but they take out the Satanic Verses Incident itself, so the insertion of the couplet, when they talk about the biography of the Prophet during this time period while in Mecca, in the first about 10 years of revelation. So it's interesting because now understanding the actual, if the incident did take place, like I said, it is contestable, then you would understand why the widespread prostration took place of two opposing parties which have radically different beliefs. So in one instance, these gods are venerated as daughters of Allah. In another instance, it is seen as a huge blasphemous statement against God and the other tradition in Islam. So it makes sense now, knowing about the goddesses and their status, as to why the Quraysh would have prostrated. It doesn't make sense to me that, this incident is recounted with the prostration without the Satanic Verses Incident narrated, because it doesn't make sense of the prostration itself, whereas the insertion of the verses, mistakenly albeit, into the recitation makes sense of the event of the prostration. So I just wanted to add that little bit there. So now we're going to take a look at the narrations themselves. What exactly is being investigated here? So Ahmed brings 50 riwayas, and riwayas in Arabic means narrations in English, to substantiate his fundamental claim, being that there was a clear, dramatic change in the way the Islamic Orthodox community approached the Satanic Verses Incident from the first centuries of Islam to the 20th century. Through the reading of Ahmed's publication, the reader gets an idea of exactly how over the centuries change occurred, as evidenced by, like I said, the 50 riwayas of the Satanic Verses Incident, and how they were picked apart or substantiated by scholars of tafsir, which is Quranic exegesis, and Sirah Maghazi, biographical accounts. Though the incident is not found in canonical hadith collections, it is, however, found in non-canonical hadith collections. In order to investigate, scholars look into different aspects of the hadith tradition, composed by the matan, which is the text itself, the narrator, which is basically the trustworthiness of the narrator, and the isnad, the chain of narration. The tradition of isnad is integral to the hadith methodology and involves investigation of the narrator, like I said, the chain of narration, and the contents, with scholars subjecting the transmissions to rigorous verification to prove validity of an apparent saying of the Prophet Muhammad. It should be noted that Sir Maghazi and Tafsir were not subject to as much rigor as the hadith collections with Ahmed ibn Hanbal, the founder of the they weren't subject to as much rigor as the hadith collections, and Ahmed ibn Hanbal, which is a famous scholar in Islam, says that 3 genres have no isnad: Maghazi, eschatology, and tafsir. This could be attributed to hadith being prescriptive and authoritative, whereas tafsir and Maghazi instead using as many sources as possible to build a narrative history of the life of the Prophet. In other words, if Sir Maghazi and Tafsir were subjected to the same scrutiny as the Hadith collection, the canonical Hadith collection, there would be virtually no narrative history of the life of Muhammad. It should also be noted that the author distinguishes between bad isnads, those that don't meet Hadith standards, and fabrications, as the two are not synonymous. The author argues that during the period before 150 years, Sir Maghazi and Tafsir were expressed using weak isnads, not fabrications, and following the 150 years where hadith methodology was more prominent and stronger isnads were the standard, they used the same isnads and did not resort to fabrication. It makes no logical sense, then, that the isnads would be fabricated in the period before 150 years, where incomplete isnads were sufficient certification of the genealogy of reports. Among the narrations is that attributed to Musa ibn Uqba, who died between 85 and 141 after Hijrah. His Maghazi has not survived intact, but is highly praised by 2nd century authorities, with extensive citations from it in medieval literature. A large portion of the transmission of his work is brought to use via his nephew, Ismail ibn Ibrahim ibn Uqba, and Muhammad Fulayh al-Madani. The author notes that although the various citations from Musa are largely identical or similar in wording, they contain some critical differences that radically affect the meaning of the incident, to the point where the accounts may be construed as contradicting each other. The transmissions of his Maghazi include those from Muhaddithun, which are hadith scholars, including Ismail ibn Abdullah ibn Uwais al-Madani, who appears in the Sahih of al-Bukhari and Muslim, and Qasim ibn Abdullah, cited by Daraqutni. Urwa ibn al-Zubair, one of the most prominent scholarly figures in early Islamic Mecca, and counted among the 7 jurisprudents of Medina, regarded as having provided the foundation for Medina's legal thought, is mentioned in numerous seerah reports, which make up a substantial biographical narrative. The author says it is fairly certain that his narrations were transmitted from Urwa in Egypt in the 130s by Abu al-Aswad Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn Abdurrahman ibn Nawfal al-Madani, who died in 136, 137 after Hijrah, who is known as Yatim Urwa, or Urwa's orphan. Almost all of Abu al-Aswad's reports from Urwa are transmitted by Abdullah ibn Lahiya, who is the Qadi of Egypt and one of the most famous Egyptian scholars in the 2nd century, whose reports appear in the 3 canonical hadith collections. The 14th riwayah cited by Ahmed is considered a Sahih Mursal report, which means it was transmitted highly reliably, but goes back to a Tabi, which is a successor, instead of a Sahabi, which is a companion of the Prophet. At-Tabari cites it in Jami' al-Bayan with the isnad, coming from Yunus ibn Abdullah al-Misri, which goes back to Abdullah ibn Wahab al-Misri, which goes to Yunus ibn Yazid which goes back to Yunus bin Yazid al-Aili, which goes to Muhammad bin Shihab al-Zuhri, which goes back to Abu Bakr ibn Abdurrahman ibn al-Harith. The Tabi Abu Bakr ibn Abdurrahman ibn al-Harith, a teacher of al-Zuhri, was a highly respected figure in the 1st century Medina and is remembered as one of the 7 fiqhis of Medina. Yunus bin Yazid al-Aili was the companion of al-Zuhri for 12 years and related a large quantity of material from him. Also, both the transmitted from Yunus bin Yazid are numbered among the greatest Egyptian scholars of the 2nd century. The reason why I bring this up is to demonstrate that obviously there is more to this story than simply slapping on the label of fabrication, like that original video that I showed at the beginning of this this exposition, or this description of the events and narrations involved in the Satanic Verses Incident. So it's not as easy as just labeling it as a fabrication. There are a number of notable, reliable transmitters in these narrations, and like I mentioned, one of the reports is actually Sahih Mursal, which means Sahih is the highest grade that you can get in the Islamic Hadith kind of investigative process. It's the highest grade that one can possibly have. Although Mursal means that, like I mentioned, it goes back to a tabi instead of a companion, which kind of makes it less, but basically there's no direct source from a companion, though the strength of the report, as we'll see what Ibn Taymiyyah says on the subject, who actually believed the incident actually took place, he demonstrates and he elaborates on the aspect of the number of reports and how this substantiates the claim of the incident itself, which is kind of logical, I would say, and it would be my opinion as well that the incident actually did occur and that there is no issue with the incident having taken place. I personally believe that it's rather an aspect of, because of the Orientalism surrounding it, and a lot of people have been attacking it, maybe from the Christian side, and Orientalists who've kind of taken this as a means to attack the Muslims, based on the Satanic Verses Incident, kind of spread doubt, those kind of things. It makes sense that, in the modern period, we've had this harsh stance against it, although, like I'll mention as the video goes on, there were also other scholars throughout the centuries who did take a harsh stance on those who actually stood by the historicity of the event itself. After bringing forward 50 riwayas in circulation in the first 2 centuries of Islam, the author, Ahmed, concludes and articulates the apparent ubiquitous reach and acceptance in the earliest period within tafsir and Sirah Maghazi works, having been cited by virtually every compiler of a major biography of Muhammad, such as Urwa ibn al-Zubair, Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, Musa ibn Uqba, Ibn Ishaq, Abu Ma'shar, Yunus bin Buqair, and Al-Waqidi. They also include almost every prominent early Mufassir, Abu al-Aliya, Sa'id bin Jubair, Mujahid bin Jabr, Ad-Dahaq, Ikrima, Muhammad bin Ka'b al-Qurazi, Al-Hasan al-Basri, Qatada, Abu Salih, Atiya al-Awfi, Al-Suddi, Al-Kalbi, Mukhatim bin Sulaiman, Ibn Jurayj, Ma'mar bin Rashid, and Yahya bin Salam al-Basri. Within tafsir, it would be used to explain the revelation of Quran 53:19 and Najm, and 22:52 al-Hajj, and sometimes with the exegesis of Quran 17:73, which is Surah al-Isra, 39, which is Surah al-Zamr, Surah al-Kafirun, and in addition, it was also being transmitted in virtually every important intellectual center in the 2nd century Islamic environment, from the Hijaz to Syria, to Iraq, to Transoxania, to North Africa, Medina, Mecca, Basra, Kufa, Baghdad, Messiah, Ray, Balkh, Samarkand, Mar, and the list goes on. After learning all this about the narrations, one may question why it was rejected at all. And this is where the idea of Islamic Orthodoxy plays a substantial role. The Satanic Verses Incident is rejected and dismissed as baseless on the basis of 2 epistemological principles, which the author calls the historiographical principle and the theological principle. The historiographical principle brings into play the system of isnad, which involves the evaluation of chains of transmission, as discussed earlier. On this basis, all but one of the 50 reports that narrate the incident are carried by defective chains of transmission, which are chains that include at least one or more unreliable transmitters, or chains that are incomplete and do not go back to an eyewitness. The author also notes that the only report that is sound and complete, also known as Sahih, has never been acknowledged or commented on. The theological principle involves the rejection of the report based on the principle of Ismat al-Anbiya, or protection of prophets, which is to say that God protects his prophets from error or sin. This principle can be said to be a necessary component upholding the integrity of the Quran and is grounded in Quranic verses, one of which is found in the very same surah, Surah An-Najm, to which the Satanic Verses Incident is attributed, and the verse goes, "Nor does he speak from his own desire. Indeed, it is nothing other than an inspiration inspired." Also, given the many verses in the Quran supporting this theological principle, it wouldn't make sense on the basis of a Sahih Mursal report to then append this consideration given the weight of the Quran when it comes to its truth claims. Even matters of law, if a hadith contradicts the Quran, it is rejected, even if it is the marfu hadith, which means it goes back to the Prophet himself in a sound Sahih chain. Therefore, Mursal reports would be more susceptible to this guiding principle, given that they do not go back to a companion. Though, in opposition, one may use the numerous verses of the Prophet, numerous hadiths of the Prophet and other prophets, the numerous verses of prophets and other prophets implying his susceptibility to influence by means of his desire to bring his people together, as well as abrogation of the Satanic verses as a means of countering this claim. As God states in the Quran, in chapter 11, verse 12, "It may be that you are leaving out a part of what is revealed to you, and that your heart is troubled by it when they say, 'Why does no treasure come down to him, or angel accompany him?'" There exists also the ayat of rebuke, known as ayat al-itab, and just brace with me that I don't really know the actual Arabic, I'm only reading the English transliteration, such as the instance where he had frowned and turned away when the blind man came to him, as the Quran says. Of course, this issue is contentious, as is clearly evidenced by the supporting arguments on either side of the dispute. Two prolific scholars of the 6th century after Hijrah, the Maliki jurist Al-Qadi Iyab al-Yahsubi and the Persian Shafi'i theologian and jurist Fakhruddin Razi, wrote extensive and highly influential refutations of the Satanic Verses Incident by means of aql, which is reason, and naql, which is transmission, or the isnad argument. They also both intensely rebuked anyone who contested their stance on the basis of attributing oppositional stances the guilt of kufr, or heresy, going so far as to label those who accept its historicity as apostates. The prominent scholar Ibn al-Jawzi stated the incident as an example of the incredible stories and corrupt explanations of the Persians amongst the commentators of the Quran. Of course, there still exist dissenting voices, namely the giant in Islamic scholarship, which I mentioned previously, Ibn Taymiyyah, who establishes that there were differences of opinion on the historicity of the event, while holding the event as true, and in fact states that the event itself poses no issue to the veracity of the Prophet and his speaking the truth, but rather acts as greater proof of this reality. He held the view originally proposed by Shafi'i in the 3rd century that if an incident is reported by a number of mursal chains, these chains then reinforce one another and the reports are accepted. He states, "In this way we can know the veracity of the general content of reports which have been transmitted by several different chains, when one chain on its own is insufficient, either because its projection back to a Sahabi is in doubt, or because of a weak transmitter." So, to conclude, as is evidenced by the lengths and contents of this video, the author Shahab Ahmed did a great job at elucidating and picking apart all the evidence and reports surrounding the incident of the Satanic Verses, and proving his point that when looking at the early centuries of Islam in comparison to the 20th century, the acceptance of the historicity of the event has undergone substantial alteration, leading to the current day Orthodox position, which is arguably contestable. Because this incident is often cited by Orientalists wishing to discredit Islam, I can see how adherence to the view of its rejection would best suit the community at large. though I do not think a simple dismissal of the incident is academically honest for those who are inquisitive on what has been spoken about and discussed in regards to it. In a seminar on May 3rd, 1966 by the Cairo journal Liwa al-Islam, which was in response to the Satanic Verses Incident and attended by prominent Egyptian religious scholars at the time, one of the scholars in attendance opined that the published editions of medieval Islamic works be reviewed and purged of any mention of the incident. Also, a short video by a prominent Islamic American scholar, Abdul Nasir Jangda, which I mentioned at the beginning of the video, simply states the incident as being fabricated with no further explanation. Though I'm sure these efforts are in good spirits, it doesn't help those who wish to have a full view of the discussions surrounding the historicity of the event, so as to maintain integrity and academic honesty, and it is for this reason that I read the book in its entirety. Investigation into the incident endowed me with great insight into the development of orthodoxy on this issue, and the differing opinions on issues that some equate with disbelief and heresy, which has opened my mind further and sparked a greater desire to learn in the fields of theology and history. As we are at the end of this video, I hope it has done the same for you as it has done for me, and if not opened your mind, at least endowed you with further information on the religious inquiry of the Satanic Verses Incident. With that, I will leave you and see you in the next video. Take care.